All right, well, thanks everybody for joining me. I know that everybody that is on the talk thus far, you all know me. And I think you probably know my story and how I got into doing lectures kind of based on nutrition. But if you don't, 7 years ago, on top of treating my patients with acupuncture and herbs, I got into using a lot of nutritional interventions because I took a deep dive into nutrition when my mom was diagnosed with dementia. And I was trying to figure out how I could help her. And along that journey, I also then started learning more about fasting and all of the great health benefits that can come from fasting, which led me to read a book by Dr. Jason Fung, who's done some really interesting research around using fasting kind of as a therapeutic modality for some of his patients. He recently has written a book called The Cancer Code, which is basically what this lecture is based on. When I read that book, I just learned a lot of new stuff about cancer that I never knew. The research that he founded the book on was fascinating to me. And when I get fascinated with something and I get excited about something, then I just want to talk to whoever will listen about what I've learned. So we will go ahead and get started on this lecture that's entitled Eat to Live, because basically that's what this is going to come down to. Okay. So let's talk about the defining hallmarks of cancer, right? There are certain things that we know to be true. It grows, it's immortal, it's hard to kill off, it moves around, right? If we don't catch these cancers in time, they will move around to different parts of the body, they'll metastasize. We all know this, but it also uses something called the Warburg Effect. And basically this is the way that this cell eats and what it needs energetically to grow and metastasize and all that. And we'll talk about the Warburg Effect later on. But I wanted to talk a little bit first about how it grows. So there's two different ways that cancer cells can grow. They can either be called oncogenes, where they just have the ability to grow rapidly and reproduce, or they can also grow by reducing our body's ability to kill the cell. So these are called growth suppressors. So what it does is these cells actually block our body's natural killer cells. And so these killer cells that we have, roaming around our body, whose job is to mark these bad genes, these bad cells, attach to them and take them out of our body, those things get suppressed. And so when they're suppressed, these cancer cells can flourish. Right, so there's a couple different ways that that cancer can grow in the body. When they do this, obviously it resists cell death, and then these cells can also grow because they induce angiogenesis, meaning they can start to make their own blood supply. So they produce new blood vessels so that they can get more blood and oxygen and nutrients to do what they need to do. All right, so those 4 things are the defining hallmarks of cancer. But what else do we know? So what have all these years of research really taught us about the causes of cancer? Well, they have evolved over the years, right? So the first thing that we heard about was that there were carcinogens, right? These different factors that increase our risk for cancer. Things like if we smoked, right? Now we know if we smoke, it increases our chance for cancer. If we're exposed to too much radiation, it can increase our risk. There's certain viruses that we have, like if you have hepatitis B or C, you have human papilloma virus, or if you have the Epstein-Barr virus or HIV. These particular viruses can actually increase your risk for cancer as well, as does a bacteria in your gut called H. pylori, which again, we all have. It's just a matter of how much do we have and is it problematic? So these are the risk factors, right? So we know that these will increase our risk, but we also know not everybody that smokes or who's had radiation exposure or have these viruses, they don't necessarily get cancer. So then they try to figure out, well, why do some people get cancer with these risk factors and others don't? So then the next theory, right, which is what most of us know today, is the gene theory, right? It's officially called somatic mutation theory. This theory views cancer primarily as a disease caused by an accumulated genetic mutations. So somatic cells basically include all cells in our body except for those responsible for sexual reproduction. And it's the mutation in these somatic cells that accumulate, and then a random aggregation of these cells may be enough to turn into cancer, right? So these cells, like in our breast, our lung, those type of things, if enough mutations get together and form and grow, these can cause cancer. So a prime example of this is, right, women or in men with the BRCA1 or 2 gene, right? Everyone kind of knows about this gene because you probably all remember when Angelina Jolie found out that she had this genetic mutation. So preventatively, she went and got a double mastectomy and hysterectomy, right? She's like, I'm taking all the tissue out that could turn into cancer. But when you look at this statistically, that particular gene only accounts for 3% of all breast cancer and 10% of all ovarian cancer cases per year. So it really doesn't increase your risk that much. So if we take a little bit of a deeper dive into this genetic theory, because that is what really we've learned about all these years, because they've spent decades and decades trying to find the one gene that they can treat, right? So they've spent upwards of $20 billion to try and figure out this whole gene, this genetic component. But unfortunately, the common cancers in the early 2000s were just as deadly as they were back in 1971. So unfortunately, all this research and all the money they spent really has failed to produce a lot of insights into cancer, and likewise, not many useful treatments. Oh, I'm going to skip. Sorry guys, let me go back. There we go. There have been some drugs that actually have helped, but they're few and far between. There's a particular pharmaceutical called Herceptin that if you are a breast cancer patient with a HER2 positive gene, taking that drug really does reduce your risk of death by about 1/3. In 2009, there's another pharmaceutical that was discovered and used for CML, which is a type of chronic leukemia. That one has actually almost wiped out all of the deaths from that particular type of leukemia. So that one's been really effective. But for the most part, this targeted gene therapy doesn't produce much promise. And the reason why it doesn't work is because most cancers only share a minority of genetic mutations. When you look at the entire tumor, there's so many different genetic mutations throughout its genome that there's really no particular drug that can target all of those mutations, right? Because cancers are always changing, right? They're evolving and they're mutating in order to survive. That is what our body does, right? That is it. It wants to survive. Cells want to survive, so they're always, changing their colors. And so you can't really find a single drug that's going to be able to wipe out all of the mutations that are found in an entire tumor. I mean, interestingly enough, back in 2012, they took this big look at over 30,000 people, right? Some had cancer, some didn't have cancers. And what they found is that the vast majority of the people, right, they all had these aberrations with these genes, right? So everybody basically had these mutated genes that they thought caused cancer, but yet some people got cancer and some didn't, right? And so I always talk to people how we all have cancer cells, right? They're always there and they're trying to find their way into a form of a tumor, but for some reason, some people get them and some people don't, right? So we know that there's risk factors that can, increase our risk to getting cancer. We do not know that DNA may play a role in initiating cancer. But the real question is, and the one that we need to get answered is, why do some cancer cells grow while others die off? And that is what this new cancer paradigm, kind of the latest and greatest research, has come to look at. They're looking at both the seed, right, the cell, the mutated cell, these risk factors, but they're also looking at the soil in which these cells grow. So in 1989, Stephen Paget had this great saying, right? Seeds are carried in all directions. So basically cells are carried in all directions in our body, but they can only live and grow if they fall on congenial soil, right? So these cancer cells, right, they're full of malignant potential, but if they don't get the appropriate soil, they're rarely going to bloom. And until late, cancer research has almost exclusively focused on the seed, right? The gene, the carcinogens, and they've ignored the soil. So what we're starting to look at now, basically, is the soil. So we're going to take some time to talk about both the seed and the soil, right? Because it really takes both of these to tango. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the seed. It gets a little thick, a little heavy here, but I just wanted to show you a little bit about how the particular seed plays a part in the beginnings of cancer. So we all have single cells in our body, and we have multi-cells that work together, like lung tissue, that type of stuff, right? And if you've heard me talk before, you know that we all started from a single bacteria, single cell. As we evolved, these single cells realized, like, wow, I'm not very strong by myself, but if I gather with other cells, then I become more powerful and I can do a lot more work. So as we evolved, these cells gathered together, and then they differentiated into different parts of our body. So some became lung tissue, some became cardiac tissue, brain tissue, on, right? Which then over the billions of years went from a single cell to who we are now, Homo sapiens, right? So this new part of this new theory, this atavism theory, basically proposes that cancer is a reversion to an evolutionary format, right? This trying to go back to this unicellular cell, right? Because every cell wants to exist. It still wants to be heard, it wants to flourish. And so it's always trying to rear its ugly head. But most of the time it doesn't gain any momentum, right? So basically they're saying that cancer cells exist as more of a unicellular form buried deep in every cell of a multicellular animal, which we know, we all have cancer cells, right? So they're saying they're there, but they usually don't flourish. But what happens if we get some of that suppressive programming that I talked about, how cancer cells can grow if the cells that are supposed to kill them get suppressed or get held down, then these cells can flourish. And so what they're finding is it's these kind of cells that are in between unicellular and multicellular that tend to have the genetic mutations that we don't want. And when those start to grow, that's when the problem starts. And in fact, when they look at clinical samples, the tumor suppression gene is actually 2.3 times more prevalent than the oncogene. So much more prevalent than the genes that grow rapidly. So as an example of kind of this atavism and how these old genes, or these genes that we think have evolved out, are still present, right? I don't know if any of you know, but I know people who have been born with webbed toes or webbed fingers, right? Remember back in the day, right, when we were swimmers, we needed those webbings in order to survive. But as we became, you know, more evolved and we needed our fingers instead of webs, the webbing went away. But sometimes, right, these cells that we thought had died out are actually still present. And if they gain enough steam, they'll be present when we're born. So that's why when people are born with these webbed fingers, you're like, oh, okay, that's where those cells, you know, that we thought were gone are still present. In fact, back in 2019, the Sanger Institute came up with this COSMIC database, right? It's a catalog of somatic mutations in cancer. And what they found is that cancer cells preferentially mutates those genes that develop just after the onset of multicellularity, which happened approximately 5 million years ago. Like I said, this is kind of deep, hard to understand. But again, those cells still exist in us, but typically they're held down. But they're finding with the cancer cells, those are the ones that are actually starting to flourish. So really what they think is that cancer is really not about adding more cellular function. It's about subtracting that control over those bad cells that exist in every one of us. So it's more the suppression part of cancer growth. So basically, this is kind of the phylostrata that exists in all of our cells, right? From when we were a unicellular being up until we became Homo sapiens, right? And again, all these cells exist in our body, but what they found is that it's these cells right here that tend to have that bad genetic mutation. And those are the ones that if we allow them to flourish, they will cause cancer growth in the body. Again, not going to go heavy into this. I just kind of wanted you to understand what's going on with this atavism part of this new cancer paradigm. All right, so what helps that seed grow, right? What is the soil that allows this seed to grow? Well, as we all know, right, when we plant stuff, if it has good soil around it, if it's feeding that seed well, those plants are going to flourish. But what is the soil in our body? Well, it's the food that we eat. So you've heard me talk about how food really is medicine. You've heard it before, but I'm here to tell you it is the biggest part of being healthy is what we put in our mouth, right? We eat a half a ton of food every year. We eat 35 tons of food in a lifetime. So if we feed ourselves, not ourselves, well, then they will treat us well. But if we give them the food sources that they like to eat in order for the cancer to grow, then that cancer will be very happy. So what we're going to talk about is the foods that tend to help cancer grow versus the foods that suppress it, all right? Because again, food is the only energy source we have for our cells. Whether it's cancer cells or non-cancer cells, food is the only energy that supplies them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the BRCA1 and 2 gene again. And because kind of shows you how a change in our diet really does make a big difference. Because for those people born before 1940 with the BRCA1 and 2 gene, the risk of them developing breast cancer before the age of 50 was only 24%. But those born after 1940, right, kind of when we started to eat a lot more high carb, low fat, that type of diet, right? For those people, their risk increased to 67% of getting breast cancer before the age of 50. And what was found, right, is that the problem wasn't the gene, because the gene was there before 1940 and after, but it was the environment, right? And those are mostly the food changes that allowed these cancerous tendencies to manifest. You know, and there are other things that affect us, right? I mean, the toxins on the food, the toxins in the air we breathe, more stressors in the world, that type of thing. Those can also lead to more cancer diagnosis, but for the most part, it really is about the food that we eat. So let's look at some more samples. So we're going to look at some Aboriginal populations. I'm going to talk about the Canadian Inuit of the Arctic, and they mirror most other native populations, but this particular population had a study done. And in 1949, a report of this population uncovered only 14 cases of cancer in a 10-year span, which is really low, right? And most of those cases were cancers from people who had that Epstein-Barr virus. Remember in the beginning, I said it was one of the risk factors. So it was really only the people that had Epstein-Barr that went on to get cancer. But after World War II, this population was forced out of their traditional lands and pushed into more urban settings. They were also forced to change their diet. So they went away from their traditional diet, which was high in protein and high in fat, and low in carbs and vegetables, to a refined grain and sugar diet. And lo and behold, 40 years later, the rates of those Epstein-Barr virus-related cancers, right, that didn't change. But the rates of lifestyle-associated cancers, cancers like lung and breast and colon, those types of cancers rose precipitously. Again, the main thing that changed was the type of foods they were eating. And how has our diet changed? Again, I think you might have seen this slide if you've heard me talk before. Back before we had tons of food and our ability to store food and process food and all that, back when we had to get our own food, we ate about 75% of our diets came from fat, 20% from protein, and only about 5% of carbs, because carbs were only available during growth season. So usually in the summer, when the fruits would grow, vegetables would grow, then they would eat them. But during the winter time and stuff like that, they just weren't available. So this is what we used to look like. Fast forward, right, back when, you know, we thought heart disease was the worst thing that could happen to us, the biggest cause of death. People started to think, well, it's because we're eating too many fats. And so they said the best way to stop that is to increase our carb intake, lower our fats, and keep our proteins, you know, moderate. But in actuality, this change in diet has really escalated a lot of the cancers in the world, right? And the reason being is because what's changed most with this increase in insulin levels, what's changed with our food changes is that our insulin levels are much, much higher. And you'll see shortly that insulin is what cancer cells really live and die for, all right? Other things have changed too. These foods have impacted other, what we call nutrient sensing pathways, which is called mTOR and AMPK. We'll talk about those later. But basically, the biggest impact and the biggest problem that's arisen is our insulin levels. And that is why, our diabetes levels have skyrocketed over the last 40 years as well. So what is insulin? So insulin is a natural hormone that's released into the blood by the pancreas in response to food. So when we eat, the pancreas releases insulin. Specifically, it's released when we eat either proteins or carbohydrates. When we eat dietary fat, insulin isn't produced, okay? Insulin is also a highly potent growth factor, and it supplies cells with all the glucose they need to do their work. So our cells work hard every day, and they need glucose to do their work. What they don't need and what we don't want is an abundance of glucose in those cells. And insulin, as a matter of fact, lots of it is used in labs to grow breast cancer tissue, which is interesting because normal breast tissue doesn't need insulin to survive, right? So, if they're feeding that to cells in order for them to grow, we probably shouldn't be having lots of high insulin levels in our body. And more interestingly, that if you take that insulin away from this breast tissue in these labs, the breast cancer shrivels up and dies, all right? That's a big sign right there, a big reason that we need to keep our insulin levels low if they know in the lab that if we decrease insulin levels, the breast cancer dies. It's interesting to me that more oncologists don't tell this to their patients, but there's only so much time in the day. Anyway, cancer cells contain 6 to 17 times more insulin receptors than healthy cells do, all right? So what does that look like? Well, this is the way that insulin works. So you've got your cells, right? And they need some glucose to work. So you need insulin to go down. They go down, they blend in the receptor sites, and then they open the little door. So the glucose, right, that's in our tissues, in our blood, can get into our cells so our cells can do the work they need to do, right? So we need some insulin because we need to get glucose into the cell to do their work. But with cancer cells, remember, they have 6 to 17 times the amount of insulin receptors than a healthy cell does. So if you think about that, they've got all this insulin going all along the cell, opening up all kinds of doors. And so it's not just letting in the glucose we need for our cells to do our work, it's letting in tons and tons of glucose. And that is what the cancer cell loves, all right? And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. But let's look at just some other interesting samples of how insulin either inhibits or causes cancers to grow. These Laron dwarfs, right? So they're little people, right? So we know they don't grow very much. And that's because they lack this hormone called IGF-1. But IGF-1 is very similar to insulin, kind of has the same effect on the body, right? It makes us grow. So if we don't have these growth factors, a lot of ability to use insulin, then we actually reduce our risk of cancer. So this particular population only has a cancer rate of less than 1%. All right. So really, cancer is not something that they have to be worried about in their lifetime. Unlike people with Cowden syndrome, right? These people actually have a rare genetic mutation, right, that enhances insulin signaling. So meaning that the cells have lots of more insulin receptors. Just because you have that syndrome, you have almost a 90% chance of getting cancer, right? Again, so this shows you how important insulin is to cancer growth. Another interesting fact is that taller women are at increased risk for cancer, and specifically, and I know for sure for breast cancer. Interesting, right? Who knew? Everyone thought, oh, I'd love to be a little bit taller. Well, the reason this is because in order to grow taller, you have to have more growth factor in your body. And we don't really want to stimulate that growth factor, all right? So that's kind of why taller women are at increased risk. So let's talk a little bit about these nutrient sensing pathways that I hit on a little bit earlier, right? So we have these sensors here that react to what we eat. We've got the insulin that reacts instantaneously to food. We've got an mTOR pathway that takes a little longer to look at what we have and what we've eaten. And then we've got this AMPK that is our long-term sensor. So it kind of takes a nice long look at, well, what are we consistently putting in our body and how is that affecting this certain nutrient sensor? All right. Insulin, again, is activated if we eat carbohydrates or proteins. mTOR is activated by proteins. So that is why we don't want to eat a ton of protein. I know there are some theories out there that say a high protein diet is actually very healthy for people. And it might be for some people, but I think if you're trying to reduce your risk for cancer and certainly your reoccurrence risk, you really want to keep your protein at a moderate intake. And then your AMPK, that actually looks at everything you eat. It kind of looks at the amount of calories you eat over a long haul. So let's talk more specifically about this mTOR, which is called the mechanistic target of rapamycin. I love that name, but it's better known as mTOR and much easier to say. So mTOR, when it's activated, is a potent growth factor, all right? Very potent for cancer. And again, mTOR is activated by dietary protein and insulin primarily. That's why we want to keep those insulin levels low and the dietary protein low. And what they found is that aberrations in this mTOR, the sensing part of our body, that occurs in 70% of human cancer. So we really want to keep that mTOR at a low level by reducing our protein intake and keeping our insulin levels low. Because when that's out of balance and out of whack, 70%, right, of cancers have this aberration. And then this AMP activated protein kinase. This is a big part of our growth factor, right? So this assesses everything that we eat, right? And when we have lots of stored energy, like we're eating lots of food all day long, this decreases our level of AMPK. But if we don't have very much energy stored in our body, so we're not eating as often, right? We're doing some fasting, this increases the AMPK levels in our body. When we have high levels, which is what we want, it lowers that mTOR activity, right? So that slows the growth factor in the body, slows, and more importantly, slows the growth of cancer cells. The high AMPK also increases production of new cells, new healthy cells, and increases our cell's capacity to burn fat, which is really what we want to teach our body to do, is kind of burn more fat and be less reliant on glucose. And then this high AMPK also increases autophagy, right? This is where the body is able to clean out the bad cells, and they recycle them out, and then they produce new healthy cells, right? So we want this AMPK, we want it to be high. So how do we get that to be high? Well, there are certain drugs, metformin, right, is which is used for diabetes, that can actually activate this AMPK. And that is why the makers of metformin would like you to believe that if you're on metformin, you're going to reduce your risk of cancer, which is true to a point. But if you use it long term, it's not really so great for you. In fact, kind of this new age oncology practice that a lot of people don't know about, they actually use metformin in kind of a pulsatile or cyclical way. They'll put you on metformin for a month, and then they'll take you off for 2 or 3 months, and then they'll put you back on it, because they do know that it helps stop the growth of cancer cells, but you don't want to use it long-term, day in and day out, as a cancer-reducing medication. Resveratrol, which we get from grapes and red wine, will help it. Again, this isn't an open door to go drink as much wine as you want, but, having a few glasses a week, 1 to 4 is not bad for you. Particular compound called ECGC, that is what comes from green tea. And I know a lot of us have heard, if you eat green tea or drink green tea, it'll, helps reduce your risk for cancer. That's because it activates this AMPK signaling system in the body that then slows the growth factor. Capsaicin from peppers is healthy. We all know turmeric is healthy. Garlic can also activate that. Berberine, which is a Chinese herb that I use. In fact, I use it with all my patients who have diabetes because it basically is the herbal equivalent to metformin, and it really helps keep your insulin levels low. And then fasting, right? Remember, AMPK is activated when you have lower energy sources. So if you fast and you don't have a ton of food sources available, that's going to activate this sensor that we want activated because it slows down growth. And that is why fasting is so important. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here momentarily. So what do we want to eat? And I think, again, if you've heard me talk before, this is the same thing that I'm going to say over and over, right? We have two sources of energy that feed our cells, right? Fat and glucose. Protein doesn't feed our cells. Proteins helps build cells, the amino acids in tissues, but they don't actually feed the individual cell. So they get fed by glucose. And when you don't have enough glucose, what happens is your fat cells are able to mobilize and they actually can turn into glucose. So that is why when people say, oh, I think my blood sugar is getting low, it doesn't cause you to get low blood sugar. What happens is it actually allows you to mobilize and use the fat stores in your body to then produce glucose. So what we want to do then is reduce our glucose levels and get our fats to provide a lot of the energy sources for these cells because they don't increase that growth factor like glucose does. And again, when we need the glucose, the fat cells will make it for us. So let's talk again about those hallmarks of cancer, right? It grows, it doesn't die, it moves around. But the one I want to focus on now is this Warburg effect, right? This is the deregulation of normal cellular energetics. So basically, this Warburg effect means that tumor cells use 10 times more glucose than non-cancerous cells. 10 times more glucose. So remember when I talked about the fact that cancer cells have 6 to 17 times more insulin receptors? The reason they have more insulin receptors is because they want that insulin to attach onto their cells and open them up so they can get all this glucose because they use so much sugar in order to grow, right? So if they use a lot of sugar to grow, we definitely do not want to put sugar in our body for them to munch on all day long, all right? So that's the Warburg effect. So 2 important rules to remember. What you stop eating is going to be far more important than what you start eating. So if you take nothing else away from them tonight, stop eating the foods that I'm going to talk about shortly, right? And remember, sugar really is the devil. It does nothing good for your body. It enhances your ability to grow cancer cells. It just from a chronic disease standpoint, it is the bad guy through and through and through. So if you do nothing else, please cut back on the sugar. What you don't want to eat, right? These things that will increase your insulin levels very quickly and very highly is the simple carbohydrates, right? And these are the things that we love, our candies, our cookies, our muffins, pastas, potatoes. I've talked about these in other lectures, right? You eat these, they spike your insulin levels, which is no good for the body in any way, shape, or form. You want to limit a lot of your complex carbohydrates. And I know most people think these are healthy foods, but the reason they're not so healthy for cancer specifically is that they will quickly increase your insulin levels in the body, which again, we don't want higher insulin levels because that is what leads to an increase in cancer cell growth. So you want to limit fruits. You want to kind of limit your legumes, your beans and lentils, your whole grains. And you also want to limit dairy products. Now, if it's a full fat dairy product, it's okay to eat like your heavy creams and that type of thing. If it's goat cheese, it's usually okay. But you want to avoid any dairy that's produced in the US because it has a genetic mutation in it that is not healthy for our body. All right. So again, limit dairy products, whole grains, legumes, and fruits. Don't have to rid them completely, but you definitely want to limit them. So what do you want to eat? We want to eat our high healthy fats. You can eat all the veggies you want. And yes, they are carbohydrates, right? But they have a lot of fiber. And when you have a lot of fiber, that makes your insulin levels rise at a much slower rate. So you don't get that big spike in insulin, which is what we want to try and avoid. You want to have moderate healthy protein, but when you eat it, you want to make sure that it's coming from areas where it's allowed to flourish in the way that it was meant to, right? So cows are meant to eat grass. The fish, seafood that you eat is meant to swim wildly in their waters, right? And chickens, right, they should be pastured. They should be able to walk around and peck at their leisure. You don't want them in a pen right next to, another chicken and getting fed food that they normally don't eat, right? So you want to eat those proteins that come from natural resources. You want to eat your fruit in moderation. You want to limit your gluten-free grains and legumes. And you want to, again, limit those starches, those things that increase our insulin levels like rice, lentils, and potatoes. Sources of healthy fats, again, your nuts and seeds, certain oils. Some oils are good for you, like avocado, coconut oil, olive oils. Those are the healthier oils for you. Lots of unhealthy oils, and I will tell you what website to go to look at the list of the healthy ones. Of course, your avocados are great sources of fat. The yolk in eggs are healthy. Meat fat, I know everyone used to grow up and think don't eat the meat fat. It's actually healthy for you. Dark chocolate is a great source of fat, as is butter and ghee, right? Ghee is the milk fat, the milk fat that's taken off of the dairy. But if you have butter itself that we're used to eating, as long as it comes from grass-fed cows, it's actually a healthy source of fat for you. And then again, your proteins, right? Your fish, your seafood, your eggs, your meats. Again, just make sure that they are sourced from healthy areas, your grass-fed and finished cows, your wild seafoods and fishes, and that your eggs and chickens and that type of thing are pastured. And it will say on the package, just make sure you look for that on the package. And what should your daily food map look like? Remember when I talked about kind of how that AMPK looks at the entire food that you eat throughout a day? The majority of your calories should come from fat, which looks intimidating to think about eating 50 to 70% fat, but in reality, right, fat has double the calories of all other foods. So if you're using like good oil sources to cook with, that's going to increase your fat intake. Your avocados, your eggs, that type of stuff, that really quickly increases the fat content in your diet. And again, it's a healthy source for you. You want to have about 20 to 30% of your daily diet in veggies. Protein should make up about 20. And then again, you want to limit that fruit and starches, right, to about 5% a day. And then I want to talk a little bit about fasting, right? I think it's such a healthy option for people to do. Why? And we've said this before, insulin is only activated when you eat. So if you fast for a certain number of hours every day, during that entire time, your insulin level is never spiked. And if your insulin level isn't spiked, then those cancer cells are not getting the insulin and glucose they need to thrive, right? So that is why fasting is so imperative, just for overall health, but really imperative for patients who are trying to prevent cancer or to prevent a reoccurrence. Huge. I highly recommend you institute this into your daily activities. And this just isn't a fad. More and more research is really showing all the benefits of fasting. If you don't believe me, just go to Dr. Google. It will talk all about the benefits of fasting. What you want to do, 2 easy ways to increase the amount of time you don't eat is make sure that you stop eating 3 hours before bed. So say you stop eating at 7 o'clock at night, you go to bed at 10, you wake up the next day, say at 6. Then if you don't eat again until 7, then you're gold. You've now gotten 12 hours of fasting every day, right? So I would say strive for at least 12-hour fast every day. A recent longitudinal study that looked at breast cancer patients actually found that for women who fasted at least 13 hours a day, they really reduced their rate of reoccurrence. I tend to think, it's better to do 14 to 16 hour fast most days. And you just kind of gently work up to that. But fasting is huge, huge, and so important for overall health. And I want to talk a little bit about hunger. So it's a very complex system in your body, right? And it's driven by two hormones. It's produced by ghrelin and it's produced by leptin. Okay, so ghrelin is the gremlin, like it is the bad guy. It is the thing that turns our hunger on. And then leptin, right? That is the hormone that turns our hunger off. Leptin is actually produced from fat cells. So if you're eating more fat, this is going to turn off ghrelin, right? The bad guy. It's going to turn that off, which is what we want. So really, when you increase fat in your diet, that hormone that makes you hungry actually just isn't produced as much, which is really a great benefit of fasting, right? But the other thing you need to know, and I've talked a lot about this, is that particular hormone is at its highest level at 8 p.m. We all have circadian rhythms of our hormones and our cortisols and all that. Ghrelin is actually at its highest level at 8 p.m. And that is why when we eat dinner, everybody, kind of gets up, ooh, I just need a little munch or a little something sweet after dinner. You don't. That's just that hormone trying to trick you. All right. So if you eat if you eat a dinner that's a little bit higher in fat content, more than likely it's going to decrease that level or actually just turn it off. All right. So just remember, when you get hungry at night, you want to go reach for that little cookie or something. Just tell ghrelin, you're not going to beat me tonight. I'm going to win you over. I know you're trying to trick me and I am stronger than you are. So in conclusion, right? We know that there are carcinogens that can increase our risk for cancer. We also know that there are genetic mutations that may increase our risk for cancer. But it's the soil in which they exist, right, that determines if these bad cells flourish or if they die off, right? And the way to make them die is to eat well. So my advice to you is to eat well, to live well. So here are some recommended resources for you. If you go to bulletproof.com, you can find a bulletproof roadmap on there that really lists great fasting guidelines. It gives you a good food list on what foods to eat. They're listed in green, so if you eat those, you're doing pretty good. There's a book I like called The Plant Paradox Quick and Easy. I like it because I think it does a great job of explaining how foods work in the body, and he also will provide a list of what to eat and what not to eat. He's pretty strict. You certainly don't have to follow his guidelines to a T, but I think it's just a good resource for people. Again, because I think it's an easy read. The book that motivated me to give this talk is called The Cancer Code. It's thick, it's deep, it's not the most it just takes a lot of focus to get through it. I enjoyed it, but it definitely is a pretty thick, sticky read. But hey, if you're someone who likes to get down to the nitty-gritty of cancer, then I'd say go for it. And then there's me, right? You can go to my website. I do have a 3-series lecture on intermittent fasting and good foods to eat. So if you really want to know really all the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty about intermittent fasting and everything it does, you can find those on my website. You can come talk to me. I do individual nutrition consults. And thank you for joining.